Can we make the recycling of medical plastic waste viable and feasible? This is the question we set out to solve in a workshop together with Polymer Connect in Ireland and Athlone. We did that workshop recently, and I want to share with you what we learned from that event. So, the title I would use for this is Medical Plastic Waste No Excuses. Because I think, many people are taking excuses and I want to challenge them. So, as I went to Ireland, I took a local example, and the example is of St. Patrick. St. Patrick was first a slave in Ireland, and he learned a lot about the Irish culture before he transformed it from the inside out. And I think this is a very key illustration that I want to give to everybody who is interested in making medical waste recycling. It is a conversion of belief, it is breaking a mindset. And you need to first understand that mindset. You need to understand where the system is coming from, where the incentives lie, before you can challenge and transform it. And I think this is extremely key to getting this done. Then the second thing, and this is what I talk about a lot, is the sustainability trinity. I think we need to understand that a medical recycling or medical waste recycling system needs to be good for the planet. We need to be better in terms of environmental sustainability. However, we also need to make it profitable. Our healthcare systems are under pressure and they cannot afford a higher cost for their waste. And then it needs to be good for the patient and socially acceptable, and also good for the healthcare system and healthcare system workers. If after 2 shifts, the nurse doesn't really care to select the right of the 27 bins you put in front of them, then it doesn't really work. So if they have bin fatigue, that doesn't work. So we need to make it easy and convenient for whoever is doing the actual recycling. An actual system needs everything. They need all 3 of them. It needs to be ecologically, economically, and socially acceptable. The good news about medical waste recycling is waste is pain. Hospitals primarily don't think in CO2. They care about it. They understand that this is somewhat important, but they don't measure CO2 usually. So only few hospitals or big hospital chains have science-based targets for CO2. So they're usually not measuring CO2 as one of the KPIs for their sustainability. But waste is what they care about. Waste is what they're liable for. Waste is the logistical challenge. They need to haul that around. And it's a major cost driver. In Ireland, it's 935 euros per kilo. In Switzerland, it's like 800 to 1,000. In the US, the spread is even wider. I've seen numbers that go over 1,000, over 1,500 per ton, depending on where you are. So for healthcare professionals, sustainability means tackling the waste problem. And this is, I think, what we can all agree on. It's a pain point and it needs solving. The question is, can we solve that? What challenges are there? And I want to give you the insights that we have learned in the last several years, but also like from the workshop. I think the challenges, they are sevenfold. There's design for recycling, and I'll come to that. And if you want to do something about that as a medtech company, you just come and talk to me. The 27 bin problem, how do we collect? How do we get people to collect? How do we make it convenient? Then transportation and logistics and economics and scale. I think those 2 go together. If we can figure out how to make it economically viable to haul all the waste and how to get to a scale where it's economically viable, we have solved a lot of the problem. Then decontamination and also like on-site recycling, I will put in, or on-site waste treatment, I will put that in there. I think this is a key enabler of the whole challenge. Then a thing that we really learned from the workshop is that regulations and bureaucracy is one of the key inhibitors. How do we get this out of the way? This is like every country has to figure out that for themselves, but you cannot be on the gas with one foot and on the brakes with the other. And like the regulations, especially waste regulations, are a brake in the system. They are just inhibiting the existence or innovation for new and better waste treatment systems. And then in the end, it's a multi-stakeholder mess. So, there are lots of stakeholders to be involved, and it's a difficult diplomatic exercise to get everybody and the right people on board. So, starting with design for recycling, I would say, design for recycling is an excuse for both of the actors. One is like the recycling system, and everybody who tries to set up a recycling system runs into the same wall. It's going to be, oh, the devices are not designed for recycling. Usually people will start with packaging who are or will be more designed for recycling in the future. Then at some point you need to tackle the device, and then you will understand that these devices are not designed for recycling from the beginning, and you might despair and give up and say, but nothing is designed for recycling, so it doesn't make sense to set up a system. And on the other hand, like the meta companies, they're like, yeah, but it's incinerated anyway, so why should I design it for recycling? And, if we stop taking the other side and as an excuse, we will make a lot more progress. Of course, this is going to take 10, 15 years until we're done, until we have a functioning system, until everything is designed for recycling. But then it's going to be worth it. And we can only fight this as a two-front war. And if only one side fights it, it's not going to work. Then the second challenge is what I call the 27-bin problem. There are some take-back and recycling systems who have shown that it's technically and legally feasible to make recycling of single-use waste possible. So let me rephrase that. If you have a contaminated single-use medical device, it is possible to recycle it and use that plastic and these materials for other products, including medical device. And this is what they've proved. Johnson & Johnson, Ambo, Boston Scientific, probably there are more that I don't know of. And they've proven that it's possible. But this is not scalable. If you have one bin for one manufacturer and you have 27 suppliers, you simply don't have the space for 27 bins. There is space for maybe 5 or 6 bins. It's like patient data, uncontaminated plastic waste, sharps, contaminated waste of all sorts, and then maybe glass and medicine. And that's about what you have space for. And then maybe one manufacturer's take-back program, but not 27, as I said. So we need a one-bin solution that is on a wide enough scale so that we get to scale in order to get the economics. So this is what the challenge is. Then logistics and transport. There are many logistics companies, and these logistics companies tend to be monopolized. It sounds like I'm a bit antagonizing them. I'm not. It is a fact that only few companies per country usually have the permits to haul medical waste. And it's a difficult business to be in, These are key partners to get on board. Because if you can't get a license to haul contaminated medical waste, it's going to be difficult to set up a recycling system. Bare nearly impossible. And these are the ones, Stericycle would be the one for Ireland, but Remondis is very strong in Germany, Interzero, there's a bunch of others. But what these companies all have in common is they have very strong market position, so they have good connections to the hospitals. They're charging for the waste, and this is how they get rid of it. And, usually they're sending this to incineration. And they would have the same incentive to go and take the waste and bring it to a recycler. Usually they are hindered by regulations and bureaucracy. So this is definitely a key partner to get on board. I would not antagonize them. I would try to work together with them because they see the waste all day and they see the challenge. So I think they are also very willing to get on board with this. Of course, if they can have a piece of the pie. Then how do we actually pull this off? Because usually this has to be incinerated because it is infectious. It is contaminated. How do we get rid of it? Is you can decontaminate and change the waste code from contaminated waste to usual waste. So you change the waste number, so to say, by decontaminating or sterilizing them. Usually it is done by hot steam. So this is standard method, autoclaving, but there are also microwave systems. There are also chemical recycling systems. And then the question is always, do we sterilize it offsite or do we sterilize it on-site? And if we sterilize it on-site, we have a bunch of advantages. If you shred the waste on-site and you sterilize it, number one is you save the special transport. So you don't need the special transport permit for contaminated medical waste. And secondly, if you have a plastic and you have ever seen a bunch of plastic waste, it's actually pretty light and a lot of air. If you have packaging, it's usually a bunch of air that you transport around. So it's from a transport efficiency, very bad. If you shred it, you increase the density, and with that, you gain economics. So that's definitely a thing to look out for. So this is Envitec. This is an Irish on-site waste treatment company. There's also Sterilis Solution. There's also EcoSteril. There's a bunch of companies who do this. And I think it has the key advantage to really reduce the transportation cost. And, this is one key component to get to scale. Then what we also should take into account is that recycling is not the first thing that we should do. Such a system, such a one-bin system should allow for remanufacturing or recovery of some components of the devices. And here abroad, there's a bunch of manufacturers, also legal manufacturers themselves. So Stryker does remanufacture some of its devices. But the example I brought here is Vanguard. Vanguard does collect cardiac catheters and remanufactures them. So they take them, they clean them, they test them, they repackage them, they sterilize them, and then they bring them onto the market as a legal manufacturer of single-use devices, as a single-use device. So they take single-use waste as an input and generate a single-use device as an output. And they can save 50% of the CO2 according to their LCA. And they are cheaper than new catheters. So this is actually the reason why they started doing it in the 90s. They started doing it because of the price. These catheters are like 2,000, 3,000 euros per piece. And it just didn't make sense to throw them away after one use. So they re-sterilized them. They tested them if they're safe. And according to the CEO, which I know pretty well, they are all happy to use these devices on their own family. So for everybody who challenges the safety of this device, they are under the same scrutiny as every other medical device manufacturer is. And then multi-stakeholder mess. I think that we need to have the supply chain, the medical device manufacturer, the hospitals, the logistics, the recycling operations and the recycling materials. They need to work together and they need to have their incentives to work on this. And it's pretty difficult to get a bunch of medical device manufacturers, especially the big multinationals, to work together without a bunch of lawyers involved. The hospitals, they have their cost constraints, but usually they're very motivated to do so. Logistics, those are key partners. You need them on board. And then, the recycling operations, they need to make a living off of recycling. And that is currently quite the challenge. Europe has lost a lot of recycling capacity in the last years. So what do we do about that? Recycling needs to be able to make a living. And then recycled materials, I think the key learning should be is, that you can't compensate for bad quality. May be able to compensate for price with fees, with penalties, with EPR systems. But, bad quality of the material in the end has a bad quality. It's like you cannot compensate for that. So we need to be able to figure out how to make recycling high quality recycling materials. We need to figure that out. And then, you see a bunch of companies here, like the big multinationals like Stryker, Medtronic, Abbott, Boston Scientific, and how they're all called. Then the hospitals, these are like key hospitals, especially like the NHS. They are very much on the sustainability. But, also Sutherland, which is a hospital that has done a pilot with SABIC to incorporate a recycling of medical waste for polyolefin waste. And then this is the supply chain, but then you have a bunch of supporting cast, I would say, governments, government agencies, then let's say NGOs or government organizations. But then there's also a lot of these recycling initiatives like the Healthcare Plastic Recycling Council or REMET or Recipen or Vinyl Plus or, the digital health in the circular economy initiative from the EU, Initiative Weisserpunkt. There's a bunch of it going on, and everybody's trying to figure that out. I think the problem here is a little bit the fragmentation and the different incentives. And people do what they're incentivized to do, especially also companies. If they earn money with doing so, with their current practices, why should they change? Give them a good reason, give them a good incentive to change. And I think this is a blueprint of how this could be viable. So first of all, get rid of the blockades from a government and bureaucracy kind of standpoint, and then fix the economics of the system. The medical device manufacturers need to work on the design for recycling. They need to work on it. I think it would be best if they contributed to a recycling system. That might be on a voluntary or an involuntary mandatory basis. And I just want to throw in like a little bit of home in here. The Swiss KAIS, Kunststoffentsorgung im Spital, which is an association for plastic recycling in the hospital, they have voluntarily subscribed or committed a bunch of medtech companies, I think it's like 60 or 70, that pay a voluntary fee for recycling of their plastic waste. And then what you do is you charge the hospital per pound of plastic or per ton of plastic, which is less than what the waste incineration companies would charge you. Then you optimize logistical cost by either on-site waste recycling, shredding of the waste, other optimizations like if a truck comes into the hospital, get it out of the hospital with waste and all of that. Then you need to be able to have a viable scale for the recycling operations. And then you need to be able to resell the recycled materials. And for that, you need to figure out how to get it to a higher quality. It's like there's a bunch of tricks you can play with increasing the recycled properties. But, it's also about the service. If I ask a recycled material company, I need a technical data sheet, I need an MSTS, I need a REACH and ROS certification, and I need a specification. Like this is bare minimum. And if they then tell me, it's like, what do you want? It's polypropylene. Like, and then the discussion is ended. How can I advocate for your material if you don't give me the bare minimum of service that I need from you? So we need to figure out how to do that. And I think the key stakeholders to involve is really the hospitals, the healthcare system, and the logistics. Because, I think everything else will fall in place after that. And with that, you need the compelling business case to pull that off, and I think then it's possible. So if you want to get in touch with what we do and how you could get yourself involved, just scan this code and let's talk. There's also a link in the description. How this works is you scan the code, you get a calendar link, you select the time that works for you, and then you show up with your questions and whatever you want to do with us. And it's completely for free. So please take advantage of this. Then help yourself and help the algorithm. If you like, comment, and subscribe, YouTube will show you more of these videos. My videos will obviously do better. And if you want a specific topic or you have a specific question, just drop it in the comments. I read all the comments and then I can hopefully get you better videos. So thank you very much for watching this. This is a topic that is really, really, really close to my heart. It's a little bit of a hobby of mine because I really like challenges. So thank you very much for watching. Until the next time.